Welcome to the Church with No Walls podcast.
Welcome to this edition of the Church with No Walls podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Dearbone, and today I'm being joined by Colin Saxton, the stewardship theologian and director of church relations for Everence. Great to have you here today, Colin.
Thank you, Ryan. It's a delight to join you.
And so I've stumbled upon you just because the whole podcast, basically its origin has been about curiosity when it comes to religion, pre and post pandemic, how social media and live streaming plays into that. And I think because I've talked to several pastors and such throughout the course of this podcast, and we've touched on the finances and how that has impacted the church. But I was thinking, you know what? Rather than let's just talking to pastors and them about the finances of church, let's talk to the people that actually deal in the finances. And so I just did a Google search and found you, Colin, and want to bring you on to talk about because you deal with that type of money and financing, and you've seen the ebbs and flows over the past, I guess, 4 years or so since the pandemic, and even before then. So, thank you for joining us. And I want to just kind of start off. Tell me a little bit about how you got into church finances and kind of what you all do with church finances.
Sure. I'm really glad to have this conversation with you. I'm somebody who loves the church and cares about it deeply. And I still think we're digging out of COVID, and the question around stewardship and finances remains a challenging one. So my background, I was a pastor for about 18 years. I then was the head of our judicatory, so like our conference or district within my denomination for about 70 churches in the northwest part of the U.S. I did that for about 8 years. Then I was the head of our denomination. I worked in the world office for about 7 years for a branch of our denomination. And when I left there, I was hired by Everence, who's an Anabaptist stewardship organization that started after World War II. It was first called Mennonite Mutual Aid, and it was trying to help Mennonite conscientious objectors who had come back from World War II and had no access to the GI Bill. And so the church said, how do we care for these people? And Mennonite Mutual Aid was formed. Now, 80 years later, we do a wide variety of things. We offer employee services and benefits. We do banking services. We have a foundation. We do financial planning. We work with individuals, churches, and families to think about the integration of their faith and their finances. My particular role is now as the stewardship theologian is to help us think about that. So I get to do some teaching and writing, speaking, and I have an opportunity to continue to connect with congregations to help them think about these questions.
And one thing that I guess growing up in church, and you kind of hear about it, people don't want to talk about the finances of the church, but people want to talk about the finances of the church because it's supposed to be that church is not about the money and the finances to build a new building or to keep the electricity on. But if you don't talk about that and the level of giving and what it's going to, then theoretically there is no church building or there is no functioning church for outreach. So talk a little bit about, in your experience, we'll kind of kick there, that conversation, that in between of finance and religion. Where do people go with that, especially because you guys work with both religion and finance? How do you have that conversation or start that conversation?
Right, that's a great question. One of the things that we do is it's safe for us because we're this outside group where we can come in and start that discussion, whereas many pastors are terrified, frankly. Maybe they've been trained to not talk about finances, or they felt pressure to not talk about finances. We have this very strong money taboo, right, within the church. You don't talk about it, and so you look at the average number of churches that they'll maybe talk about money one Sunday a year. That's the way that they talk about it. When in fact, of course, Scripture, it's one of the most discussed topics in all of Scripture. Over 2,000 verses around money and resources, and talked about in the broadest sense. And so, if we limit the conversation to just getting people to write a check, we're missing out on the discipleship aspect of it. That money is often the highest source of stress in people's lives. And they would like to have that conversation in a safe environment where they see the connection between their faith and their finances. And so what we try to do is help equip churches to have that discussion in meaningful ways.
And so then looking at the trend of church giving, because some people will say it's up, it's down, it's cyclical, it kind of is like a roller coaster. Where were we pre-pandemic in terms of overall church giving? Were we seeing more? Were we seeing less? Was it kind of stable? Where were we?
Yeah, it is a complicated picture in part because the data, though consistent, it isn't identical. And so you can look at different places. I think pre-pandemic, there was a nervousness and anxiety clearly in the church. There was the rise of the nuns. We were the nuns in the sense of no religious affiliation. There was this sense that the church was getting older and we were missing out on younger people. The median size of churches had diminished. In 2000, that was 137. By 2020, it was down to 65. And so we're seeing the decline of congregations across the board. 70% of congregations around just before the pandemic were under 100 people. 10% of congregations were over 250, but nationally that captured 60% of the church-going population within that 10%. So you have these very large, quote unquote, successful churches and these kind of small, struggling churches. There was a study done by a group that looked at the national, it was called the National Study of Congregational Economic Practices right before COVID. And some of the things that it recognized were, if you look across the board, across regions, across the various denominations, really what you were seeing in terms of congregations, about a third were growing, a third were holding steady, and a third were declining. Financially, about 45% were growing, and about 35% were declining. And so it really was kind of a mixed bag.
And so looking at when the pandemic hit, what were the trend lines then? Because obviously, for a time, most people weren't even in church
Right.
to do anything. Then they started coming back in little pieces and parts. But when the pandemic first hit and we didn't know if churches were ever going to open again, what did you see? What did we see?
A lot of panic at first, right? I mean, everybody was nervous because church, in my mind, is not an event on Sunday morning, but for a lot of people, that's what it is. You show up to church, and if you can't have church, where at that time, 80% of revenue came in on Sunday mornings, at least in most places, all of a sudden that was gone, and people were terrified at what it was going to mean. I think the other thing that made folks nervous was we were worried that the economy was going to tank. That, of course, didn't happen. The stock market went up and people had more disposable income than they thought they would. And so people who had the capacity, who weren't affected by job loss or layoffs during the pandemic, typically stepped up. And so many churches, I think 50% saw an increase in giving during the first couple of years of the pandemic.
And so because of that fact, did you what? And most people, I'm assuming, were using online measures, online giving because they couldn't be in churches. Were they calling you all a lot to kind of get some advice and say, how do we transition? Because we need to keep, we need to be able to still be solvent whenever this thing ends. So.
Right. We did get a lot of calls, both from people who were thinking, I've got to get my wills and estate plans going because they were afraid that they were going to, kick off during COVID, but also a lot of congregations who were just saying, how do we transition? What online resources are available? What are the good ones? What are some of the other creative giving tools that are out there? Because to me, one of the blessed things about COVID is it sort of gave us a chance to reset a little bit, to refocus congregational life and remember why we exist and what we are called to do. And so there was a lot of that sort of soul searching, I think, going on in the church, including around money and the recognition that people can support their congregation through a wide variety of means. For most of us, 95% of our assets are non-cash. And so it's property, it's stocks, it's retirement accounts, it's those kinds of things. And so they would look to organizations like ours, Everence, to say, how do we help people think about giving in alternative ways? And so we had some really great conversations during that time.
And then did you see, because obviously going online and stuff like that, uh, most people use credit cards. Like you said, cash on hand is not something that most people have anymore. I know before the pandemic, our church, there was no, now we have a Square machine. Now we have an online giving resource. But before it was, if you didn't have cash, you didn't put anything in. You just kind of either had to go to an ATM and get some money, or you just said, well, I'll catch it next time when I have cash. So were there churches that during the pandemic were hesitant or maybe even, I guess, standoffish about going to an online system, whether it's because of the safety of online or the process, cost, all these factors that you now have to think about to go online with your giving?
Absolutely. I think the safety issues were significant for some groups. I think the other groups the ones who struggled, of course, the most were the low to moderate income congregations, the ones who didn't have a lot of people, who may have a lot of technical expertise. And so they really struggled through that time. And so there were about over 40% of congregations actually saw a decrease in their giving because we had moved away from that cash-based society or form of giving, focused on Sunday morning to something else, and it took some churches some time to sort of catch up.
And did some churches perish because they just didn't adjust?
Absolutely. Yeah, I was digging around looking at statistics around that before talking with you. And one of the things I saw was in 2014, there were about 4,000 Protestant churches that opened, which is phenomenal, mind-blowing to me in that year, and about 3,700 closed. So again, a small increase during those years of startup congregations within the US. But when you get to 2019, which is when the pandemic was, there were 33,000 that opened and 4,500 that closed. 3,000 opened, 4,500 closed. So I think it exacerbated the economic challenges that a lot of small churches were having, and they just got tired and gave up and just couldn't do it anymore.
And so for for you all, as you're seeing this kind of fluctuate, how are you all coming up with strategies and plans to tell these churches or these members who are worried, but they're also trying to figure out, okay, what does this new landscape look like? How are you all navigating it? Because you all are the ones that people are coming to. So how did you navigate the kind of the plan of think through to get to be able to give them good and solid advice?
Yeah. Um, I think one of the trends again that happened across the board was this sort of opportunity to reset and to remember what it means to be the church. And so a big thing that came up for lots of congregations was the refocus on their why, their purpose, their reason for existence. And so a lot of our work around leadership was helping congregations do that discernment work, that reflective work about how why we exist, how we function in the world, what we're called to do, and to think about how that then is reflected in their budgeting process. How is your budget a moral document? How is it a reflection of your mission rather than just being something you do every year and you just sort of fill in the numbers? So we focused on a lot of best practices around helping churches develop that sense of self. We talk with them about the creation of a narrative budget, which is a sort of story form way to have a budget that goes alongside your account lines, but just says, here are the few things that we focus on. Here's some ways that we're making a transformational difference in the lives of our own members and in the lives of our community. And so how do you tell stories well? We help churches look more honestly at their revenue streams in terms of where does our money come from among our members? So creating a giving pyramid that helps them know where our money comes from our members, hosting some of these difficult conversations around money. I think one of the things that we are really working on, especially this coming year, is around financial wellness, because we recognize that so many young people, they absolutely want to be generous. Their first thought about generosity is not in giving, it's in volunteering, it's in emotional support, it's in hospitality. Giving is not the highest form of generosity as far as they're concerned, in part because they don't have the financial resource to do it. So how do we help young people look at budgeting and cash flow and retirement and just thinking about financial stability, encouraging congregations to host those discussions? Because again, this is a way that congregations can actually help their members and surrounding community by having these discussions and giving them practical resources that help people achieve some level of stability so that they can eventually give to something they care about.
Absolutely. That's a really good answer. During the pandemic, there were a lot of churches obviously that started going towards more social media means, more live streaming means. I know my church, we started off just using a tablet and going live on Facebook because that's cheap and easy to do. Some churches, went a little bit heavier. They bought more they bought equipment, started doing, kind of a bigger production. And we since have moved into that realm as well. But did you have any calls or people saying, hey, we want to do this live streaming thing, or we need to do this more technological upgrade, but we don't know if we have the money to do it. We don't know if we have the finances to do it. And if we do it, are we just going to be throwing away thousands of dollars if we don't get a return on that investment?
Right, right. I see that's one of the questions that I don't think we've recognized the full answer to yet. That's my personal bias. There were a lot of grants that were available to help churches move to live streaming. I think that the data was something like before the pandemic, only 30% of congregations in the US had any kind of live streaming. Afterward, it was closer to 90%, and we're still hovering around that. The number of people who attend online continues to decrease. So as I travel around the US and meet with congregations, what I look at is think about how do you do that well? How do you be church in a hybrid way, right? I mean, because if church is more than an event on Sunday morning, and we're not making it a pay-per-view thing where we get folks to, to pay to watch on Sunday morning, but how do we actually be church to those people who've chosen to continue to participate in this community, but from a distance? So whether it's through service or whether it's through, work within leadership or providing pastoral care, those kinds of things, that's a really great question. An example is I'm working with a congregation in Indiana right now. They just got $1 million gift from a member who passed away. Of all the churches that I've seen within my sphere of influence, they're one of the best that has focused on being a hybrid church. They're really intentional about it. We want to be this hybrid community. In the course of this conversation, though, they've recognized it's been really challenging. It's hard for people who are not there to not feel like second-class persons. They recognize that the focus on hybrid stuff sometimes takes away from the care that they show for people who are in person. And so it's a challenge, and they're navigating that. And I think navigating it really well, but it's going to be interesting to see how that continues to evolve.
I know for our church, there's been some ebbs and flows. Like, we might get a random gift from somebody who's a viewer who has no affiliation with the church, and might be a nice size gift, and we may not get anything else. And then to your point of people coming back into the fold, coming back into the sanctuary versus those who don't. And you can sprinkle your money around now to multiple churches. You could watch 5 different churches in a day and give a little bit to all of them, and none of them be your quote unquote home church. So because of that, how would a church plan for an uncertain financial, I guess, picture, because you just don't know who might be viewing and might toss you a good amount of money, or if your people aren't coming in, they're not giving you money, but they're giving another church money.
Right. Those are great questions. For me, I'm actually helping my home church do some of this right now. We've got about 100 families who participate in our congregation. We have an online presence of probably 15 or so folks a week. Some of them live out of state, who just said, this is the place where we feel at home. And so we try in every possible way to include them in information, to recognize they are a part of our community, and to encourage folks to give as part of this community. Again, not because they support the overall mission of the church. And so helping again to tell those stories of here's how we together are doing good in the name of Christ. Here's how we are doing the greatest good that God has called us to do within our community. I think one of the challenges, though, with that, especially for young people, is that if you look at demographics of just differences of why people give across the age span, younger people tend to give because of a sense of community and compassion, rather than older people who tend to give because of a sense of challenge and commitment. And so for people, younger people, especially who are online, who are more likely to join online than older people, how do you help them feel that sense of community? And how do you help connect them to the compassion work of the church, where we're actually making a difference in people's lives?
So a pastor or a church shouldn't be scared to address that, to tell that narrative, to show, hey, you've tuned into such and such church or service. Here's what we're doing. Here's how not like a telethon, but here's how your money can help. Because as I was talking about, I was like, that almost sounds like a telethon, like the old Jerry Lewis telethon. Dollars go to, but it's one of those things where you could say, as if you're a member, or even if you're not giving to this church, here's a project that we're working on, or here's how we're able to do things. So churches should position themselves in that fashion. Correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, I actually do agree with that. I often talk in terms of concentric circles in terms of giving. How do you have your kind of your core group of people who are going to give no matter what. You've got the congregation who's pretty engaged and they're going to be there. Then you've got the community, and then you've got this larger group too. And so how do you reach each of those clusters of people using language that connects with them? Because they're not all on the same page. If we think of discipleship as moving toward God, we're not all in the same place on that journey, right? And so how do I connect that message to those people? And the online or the remote piece makes it all the more challenging. But inviting people, once you get to know them, if it's about relationships, if you're inviting people to give to things that they're passionate about, I think people will step up and participate in that. We're seeing that for people who are really committed to their church, even though they might be joining remotely.
And then do you think that there is, I know you said, and you mentioned earlier, we're still kind of figuring this out. We're still kind of fleshing it, that there's going to be like a cap where things are going to kind of settle at a certain point.
Mm.
And whether church giving, it's kind of sporadic now, or kind of up and down. It's going to level out, and what you get is basically what you can expect to get from years on, because you'll have people transiently coming in, coming out, but this is kind of the space that you occupy in terms of your finances, and you can build out 3 to 5 years based off of your range of what you've been getting.
Yeah. That would be a great question to be able to answer for congregations, right? Because everybody wants to know that is what do we have to work with? I think there's some truth to that. I think that COVID has helped us to be more realistic about ourselves. And so if it comes just to disposable income, I think we might have a better understanding of what money we really can rely on. Who are those many people? What sort of support are they going to offer? But we also are at a time of great transition in terms of economic shifts within the U.S. There's this huge transfer of money that's happening from boomers to the next generation, and then the next generation on, this transfer of wealth. And I think churches need to really be more creative about inviting members of their church to think about bequest gifts, estate gifts, as a part of their support of their congregation. I mean, you've got people who've given their whole lives to this group of people that give every week, possibly, but then we never ask them for money to think about a gift in their estate, where again, this is the greatest amount of resources that God has entrusted to them. So 30% of people in the US say, I would give a bequest gift if I knew how and was asked. In reality, only 5% of people do it. So either they don't know how to do it well, or they haven't been asked. The amount of people who give to their local church is way smaller than that, because churches have been super hesitant around that. And I think some people are concerned, if I gave a bunch of money to my local church, it would mess them up, or they wouldn't know what to do with it. And so as churches need to think about that, with our policies for gift acceptance, what would we do if God were to bless us in that particular way, or somebody was able to bless us in that particular way? To identify those things that as a community we feel called to do, that would maybe get people excited about. So that provides a way of leading those gifts, of inviting people to consider that gift in the future, rather than somebody dumping a gift on your church that has no connection to your mission, right? And then you're kind of stuck with it.
And so, what are other ways that churches can use to diversify their portfolio, if you will, and make sure that they don't have to worry should something like a pandemic happen again, or that they never reach the levels of bodies in the sanctuary that they had previous to the pandemic?
Yeah. I've seen a number of denominations do some really good and creative work around alternate income generation, or creating new revenue streams through renting space in their buildings, right? One of the losses of the pandemic is our numbers have decreased. It's helped us be, in many ways, I think, way more aware of how little used our structures actually often are. And so how can the church be a place of blessing and benefit to their community? Maybe offering a office space for a nonprofit, an entrepreneur, some other group, and generate some income for the church. That's been a growing trend within many communities that I think makes tons of sense. Plus, it's another way to engage people who may not even know there's a church there, right? Or have never really noticed, but now they're going to go to work there every day, and they're going to cross paths with people and that kind of thing. So that's one. I think a number of other congregations are having to look, also thinking about, in some ways it's the opposite focus of how do we limit our expenses. So there's a big shift towards bivocational ministries, pastors who are working not full-time in ministry, but are working other jobs alongside. This is a way of a congregation also thinking about how do we be the church together, and how do we share in the ministry? And so as much as that can feel like a loss to some congregations, it can also open up some new opportunities for gifts and service, and creative ways of keeping your budget limited.
Then should churches always, or maybe not always, but keep an eye towards technology now, putting that in their budget, understanding that you have great equipment now. You may have top of the line equipment for your live streaming and your other capabilities, but things will eventually break, things will eventually move on, and you may want to get newer equipment. So should that be something that is just going on from here on, be a part of that budget when you're thinking through whatever your budget's going to be for every calendar year?
I think so, kind of whether we like it or not, it's probably a thing. And I think learning to embrace it and think about how to do it well makes a lot of sense. I just read an article about a month ago that it said in the next few years, 90% of churches will not be using offering plates. That's one of the things that's just, and this, my friends who work within Everence, we have people who are stewardship consultants who work really closely with congregations, and they say absolutely this is the growing trend, is totally doing away with offering plates. And so there's been a big shift, just focusing not on live streaming, but on income generation. I think I mentioned that before COVID, about 80% of money came in on Sunday morning. The last data that I saw said that less than 30% comes in on Sunday morning. And so it's coming in throughout the week through a wide variety of giving channels, whether it's website, or the most popular is kind of smartphone. So how does a church help people navigate that? Not just saying, hey, you can give through your smartphone, but maybe helping them know how to do that, right?
Yeah.
Or setting up monthly giving, and also revisiting that. So sorry, I'm on I'm on a rant here, but
Go for it.
just before COVID, I often get asked to come and talk to congregations about giving. And one of the questions that I would ask is, why do you love your church? And people go on and say, and often get teary and say these, here's all the reasons I love my church. And then the question that follows, well, what is that worth to you? You know, in terms of your financial support. And I talked about the move towards sort of online giving, where we have a tendency to sort of set it and forget it, right? Kind of like a subscription. And there was an interesting little book that talked about how it offered the encouragement that every year we try to give 1% more. So if you make $50,000 a year and you give 2%, which is sort of the national average of what people give out of their disposable income, you give 2% a year, that's $1,000. Well, what if you gave one more percent, so another $500 this year? And what if your commitment was to give that to the local church? And I can't tell you how many people I had come to me and say afterwards and say, I've been giving online for years and I have never once thought about upping my giving. I did. I kind of set it and forget it. So building in these reminders to help, if we're going to move towards a digital age, we've got to be thoughtful about how do we help people continue to navigate that with faith. And then also, how do we make giving a worship experience, right? I mean, I've gotten to be in a lot of non-US cultures where the giving is such an integral part of the worship services, dancing, and people come down and they put their tithe in, and it's this sort of celebration. Here, I always joke we dim the lights because we don't want anybody to know what we're giving, right? And
Right.
so, especially if we go to an online format, how do we make giving an aspect of worship to God and thanksgiving for what God has done in our lives? It's a big question.
That's a really good question. And I think, like you said, it's kind of something we do in the dark. We don't really want to talk about it. And we don't want anybody to know what we're giving or how we're giving or when we're giving. So, yeah, that's a good question. Well, on the flip side to that, for making it something for the givers to celebrate and revel in, how do you train your finance committees? Because it used to be everything that came in the plate and it was easy, count the money, pay off who needs to be paid, put the money in the account. Now you have multiple ways of getting money. So how do you train your financial staff, whether it be one person who's in charge of the treasury or multiple people, to take in all the money and to steward it and to do all these things that are going to now be necessary, and make sure they're not forgetting a piece of it?
Yeah, that's excellent, and a little bit beyond my kind of scope in terms of practical stuff that I do. But I think that one of the upsides of that is that it's taken away the sense that only one person in the church knows anything about giving, right? I mean, we can't really operate at that like that anymore, and that's a good thing. And so finding reliable people who are trusted, who know what they're doing. I think utilizing professional services is something that a lot of churches have gone to because it's easier to have an accounting service to take care of some of those kinds of things, or payroll, that sort of stuff. If that can be afforded, it just simplifies the process for lots of congregations.
And so I always ask this of my guests, and obviously you talk about how some churches are doing away with collection plates. Do you think at some point, and we talked a little bit about the numbers of people attending church in person are they kind of dipped some. Do you think at some point that we won't have physical building churches? We won't have brick and mortar churches anymore, and we'll only have virtual churches, or there'll be more, I guess maybe more virtual churches than there will be physical in-person churches?
Yeah, I hope not. Right? I mean, I
Yeah.
hope not. I mean, as when I first got in the church, got involved in the church, I was just graduated from high school, and the whole idea of television church just made no sense to me. It's like, what happens when somebody breaks their leg? Who cares for that person when
Right.
they're watching at home? So I think that I mean, I'm being facetious a little bit, but I do think that there's been a little bit of a sense post-COVID that proximity matters, right? Community is essential to being the church, that face-to-face interaction. Yeah, I think about all the ways that Jesus touched people. I mean, literally touched people. He healed people with his hands. He blessed them. He did all these, he broke bread, all these interactive ways that you just can't replicate entirely online. It's been a great thing, especially people who are homebound or who are health compromised. It's been an awesome thing. My personal encouragement to folks is don't give up on the in-person thing. Maybe you can't get there on a Sunday morning, but get involved in a small group, get involved in a service project. We are such an isolated culture, right? People are just dying for isolation, that sense of isolation. And it seems to me this is one of the gifts that churches could offer our culture, is a place to be known, to be loved, to be cared for, to find meaning, to find purpose, to find a community and a home. And so, again, I hope we don't move that way totally.
And do you feel like, obviously the pandemic was in a lot of ways a bad thing, but in a lot of ways it did bring some change. Do you think that the pandemic and all the things that we've learned from it, coming out of it, has maybe, I don't want to say moved religion forward, but it's progressed us at a faster rate than we would have without something like that hit a reset button that made us examine who we are and our faith and our beliefs? Do you think it kind of maybe hit the fast forward button on something that was just playing at a normal pace?
I do. I think there's been a lot of good reflection about, again, who we are, what we're doing, what we're actually called to. It's been deeply challenging for lots of congregations, and so it has certainly pushed their faith, deepened it, hopefully, in many ways. So I think part of it probably depends on our perspective. Is are we willing to learn from this and grow from it, and maybe as needed grieve through it, but to continue to trust that God's going to use us despite all the hardships that were suffered.
Well, last question for you. If a pastor, a church member, finance person at church is listening right now, what's the one message you want to convey to them regarding their financial health and making sure that they're taking care of it for the health of the church?
Wow.
I'm sure it's probably a many-pronged answer, but I figure I'll hold you down to one.
Okay, great. Here's what I would say, and if you ask me tomorrow, I might answer differently. But I think about faithful stewardship and generosity in transformational ways rather than transactional ways. That the call to be faithful with the resources that God has given us. As Christians, we believe that everything belongs to God, right? I mean, that's sort of the focus of the Psalms, that everything belongs to God. And so faithful stewardship is around us learning to have that sense of integrity, to live as if that is actually true, to use our resources in a way that honors God and does the greatest good. And the generosity is an expression of the fruit of the Spirit. We are called to be conformed to the image of Christ, to be transformed that way. I think if individuals focused on that and if congregations focused on that, it would change some of our thinking about the role of money in our fellowships and help us be more exuberant in our generosity and able to then do greater good.
Wow, I like that. That's a great answer. That's a great answer for being put on the spot with that pronged approach question. That was a great answer. Now, and I appreciate you being on the podcast. I've learned a lot just in the time we've talked, and I'm sure it'll be a benefit and a blessing to all those who hear it. Because most of us aren't thinking in terms of the money and how it goes and the blessing that it can be, or all those things. We're not always thinking about that. So I appreciate your expertise and your knowledge. We were talking to Colin Saxton, the stewardship theologian and director of church relations for Everence. Thank you for your time, Colin, and we appreciate you tuning in. This has been the Church with No Walls podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Dearbone. Take care and be blessed.